So let's talk to Mila. She, her in Colorado says, how do we eliminate gatekeeping for gender affirming care? Interesting question. Mila, you are live on Takis with Arden and Lux. What's going on?
Hello again. So I am calling because I am, I guess, so the reason I asked that question is because, like, I think it's one that's like really central to, I think, bodily autonomy and trans rights. Like, I guess tend to come at it like from a perspective where, like, I believe in bodily autonomy. I think it's important. Um, it's also like to me kind of a low bar. Like my I aim like higher than to just be like, uh, how do we get uh, permission to exist, right? It's like, how do we actually get recognized? How do we fight to be recognized for who we are? And, I, things like, how do we defend like integration to sex segregated spaces? How do we challenge the way that we're often framed as like mutilating ourselves as opposed to like corrective surgery, right? I think there's a lot of like interpretations into, it's a complicated subject and it's hard to talk about something complex like it's simple. So there's kind of always that pitfall. But I think for me it's kind of rooted in dispelling the myth that like being trans, like whether regardless of how it's caused, like is it a mental disorder, right? Like for me, a mental disorder, right? Like anyone that has, let's say it's like PTSD or ADHD, schizophrenia, that brain pattern, no matter whose body that it's in, that person has that disorder, right? Like if a person is born in a tall body, a short body, a male body, female body, they still have schizophrenia because of that brain pattern. But a trans person who, has that brain pattern, but is born in a cisgender body, they're not considered to have a mental disorder, right? Like that brain pattern is just a, normally functioning female brain pattern. And to me, that shows that it's not the brain that's broken. It's just that it's misplaced. It's in the wrong environment where the rest of the body's sexual development doesn't perfectly align with it. To me, I think whether it's nature, whether it's nurture, and whether it's a combination of both, which let's be real, like sexual orientation, like identity, like there's usually both factors kind of contributing, right? I think how we look at like something like identity and where does biology interplay with that? Like I agree a lot that like there are contexts where it's useful to talk about the biology. There's contexts where it's not. So, how do we defend bodily autonomy, self-ID, eliminate gatekeeping without giving into a framing that like makes it seem like something elective or subjective, or I guess that's kind of where what I wanted to ask.
I tried to take notes because there's kind of a lot there. But like I just from the ending point, kind of tying it back to the beginning, you said something about like you feeling like bodily autonomy is maybe a low bar. Like, quite frankly, I don't think being trans is a choice, and I get the impetus to describe it in a way where cis people are going to give us the care that we benefit from for sure, and that we need. It's life-saving in like most cases. Mm-hmm. I still fundamentally find that bodily autonomy is the most ironclad argument in defense of trans rights, because it shouldn't matter any of that. Like, even if I am in fact a cis man, if I want to have breasts and wear my hair like I do, and if there's no evidence of me being a threat to anyone, because by the way, trans people have been able to use women's spaces for the last like 50 plus years without any controversy. It's only in the last like 5 years that it's become a problem. Then I find bodily autonomy to be the most philosophically robust defense. I think when you start getting into the appealing to like, our brain patterns and how like we can't have control of it, I think most of that is true to a certain extent, but I don't know that it is actually useful for us defending our rights. I think those are
like necessary,
two completely separate domains. Like, I think one of them is useful for understanding medicine and what things help us to live a happy, fulfilled life. And one of them is useful for defending our rights in a legal setting, like to a state. And I don't think there's some overlap, but genuinely, I don't think that, yeah, it's wild to me to hear somebody say that you think bodily autonomy is a low bar. Like that's, yeah, well, I'd kind of want to hear you expand on that a little.
Totally. So, I mean, I completely agree with bodily autonomy. I think it preserves the right. I guess what I mean is it's not that bodily autonomy is a low bar. It's what we get from bodily autonomy that I think we deserve more than that, right? Like, it's not just access to care. Like, yes, I want everyone to have access to care. Like, I don't think anyone should have to do a brain scan or prove that they have a biological explanation for why they're trans to deserve access to care. What I mean is that, like, you know, allowing people allowing us to exist and exist in the bodies we do, to expand on that isn't like all I want. What I want more than that is that, like, we are recognized legally, socially, to say that our identity and our gender is valid and that we deserve rights based on that. Like, often you'll hear someone like Cenk Uygur be like, trans people are entitled to constitutional rights, which to me sounds like, yeah, a trans woman is entitled to all the rights that a man has, which is like missing kind of the point of why people oppose trans advocacy or trans inclusion in the first place, which is like, you know, it's not just about being like, I'm a human being, I deserve rights. It's, I'm a human being that is a woman, whether that's because of nature or nurture or biology. I would say that a stronger defense of bodily autonomy is, for me, the strongest defense is down to like a biological explanation of why autonomy matters. It's not that I'm saying that autonomy doesn't matter at all, or that like it's a low bar. I mean that, like, to me, I feel like there needs to be, and if I'm wrong, like I'd love to understand maybe what's missing from my understanding to like understand like a more full picture, right? But I mean, like, again, go ahead.
Like, you're appealing, like you're talking like, oh, Cenk Uygur said, I think you're right about your interpretation of what he means when he says that, but also like Cenk has been a leftist. Well, you know, he has been framing himself as a leftist for a long time, I should say. He's heard all of these biological arguments. He knows all of that, and he's still, granted, that's because Cenk, I think, is ideologically fucking weak as shit. I don't know if he actually has any real values based on how he's been acting.
No,
but like that, clearly, like, knowing all of those facts about trans people and what we benefit from and our, like, all that, none of that matters to him, right? And so I'm like, it feels like, I don't know, just, it's so much harder for someone to say you don't deserve the freedom to live the life that you want to live. That is way harder of a position to defend than like to dispute the science, right? Because we're dealing with a body of power that is openly anti-scientific. Like, RFK Jr. is the head of our Department of Health and Human Services. He is a complete fucking nut job who knows nothing about biology or health. He has actively contributed to the deaths of so many people due to his anti-vax information. Like, I don't think, I don't know. I
don't think facts will cure fascism. Like, that's not what I'm not saying that we should recite textbooks and people who don't believe in climate change or people that don't believe in vaccines, right, like, are going to suddenly be like enlightened by, they're not interested in the facts to begin with, right? For me, it's not about like, I don't think it'll cure fascism, right? It's about like kind of stopping the infection from spreading to people that have good faith, but let's say have their ignorance weaponized by people who misrepresent, you know, what it means to exist in the form that we exist in, right? That's kind of more so the the reason I bring up someone like Cenk Uygur. You know, I mean, honestly, I think he's being an opportunist. I don't think he's like, you know, I don't know. I agree with you. I don't think he's like knows the biological, like, I don't think he cares about the biology to begin with, right? But like a biological, like, reality is that modern medical technology isn't will never be advanced enough to detect the nuances in human biology that give someone their gender, that makes someone's brain gender, that makes someone's brain sexually differentiated, like regardless of how that manifests. I think it's not that like a person's, whether or not someone is actually trans or like biologically trans should determine our rights. I think it's ultimately like the outcomes of, changing your gender, right? Whether that's medical or that's like your haircut and the way you identify. So like when I say I want more than bodily autonomy, it's like what I'm saying is like, how do we make that argument that like, just because a person is free to do something, that also means other people are free to discriminate against us. And that's what I don't want. I don't want to be like, well, I'm free to,
but they are. But here's the thing. I mean, I want to pass it back to you. And I also want to get Lux in here shortly, but I'm struggling to see exactly what the point of this is. Cause also like people do have the right to be bigots and they shouldn't have the right to discriminate against you in like the essential areas of like, housing and education and employment and all that. But like, I have zero interest. Like I want to move society obviously to a more accepting trans, like society overall. But I actually don't have any interest in moving individuals who are outwardly hateful. Like you're allowed to be hateful. Like you're allowed to hate people who only poop on Wednesdays. You're allowed to hate people who are like different from different countries than you. You're allowed to be a bigot. It's just that can't affect the other person's quality of life is usually where we kind of make that determination. So like, I don't understand
exactly.
Like yes, I want to move society generally. And that is a big part of what this show is. It's not always necessarily about compelling people on an argumentative like level. It's also about like considering getting people to see our humanity and having trans people be here in front. It's a lot harder to advocate against our human rights when you're actually talking to us than when you're talking to some, cis white politician about that. But like,
right.
Yeah, I guess I'm struggling to see what kind of, where's what the point of this is. Like, what are you trying to advocate for? Where do you want us to get to?
Sure. I'll let Lux contribute just because I'm curious her perspective as well. Or I'm so sorry, their perspective as well. I don't actually know Lux's pronouns. I'm sorry. Do you mind telling me what the pronouns are?
I'm the base it. I'm not going to get mad if anybody uses they, them pronouns though. I'm kind of like, don't care anymore. But for the purposes of the show, like usually it's pronouns. So I'm not interjecting very much in this conversation because I feel like we're basically just having the same conversation we already had a couple of weeks ago, Mila, like where I feel the same kind of confusion that Arden is expressing where it's like, I don't know who you're trying to package this argument for. Like, I feel like what you want is like, you're trying to clarify your arguments in a way that you feel like you can have a strong argument against discriminatory laws, right? But, like I've already expressed to you that the biological argument fails in this situation because they can just pick a different study and say that your study doesn't count and your study is biased. Like I've had the same conversation with people on this show, as a matter of fact, where I say, look, all of the data shows that this is the correct thing to do. And they're like, well, but they're ideologically motivated. Like people don't care about the facts, which is why we default to this, like, well, we should like, let's just take the Republican spin and say it's my freedoms and like, it's, I should own my own body and like, I should be able to make decisions for my kids and blah, blah, blah. Like that's just a stronger argument in a socially conservative society. Now, if you really want to hammer in on the biological stuff in the sense that like, if someone else is saying like, well, these people that I trust say that biologically you're always going to be a man or whatever. It's like, you can compare that to like, okay, well, how do you feel about their stance on funding child cancer research? Is that the people that you're really going to trust about biology? Like, are you going to let their biological argument supersede my fucking right to do whatever I want with my body? Like, I just think that it's such a weak stance to take. And like, I'm not casting aspersions on you in this way, but it is very transmedicalist to be like, I'm seeking a biological explanation. And like, we're also having two different conversations, like Arden said earlier, is like, the way that the call screener packaged your question today was more like, how do we remove gatekeeping from accessing gender affirming care? But now we're having a conversation about policy. So it's like, these are two different things, because my answer to how do we address the gender affirming care, the gap in access there, is to model gender affirming care off of the model that is presently used for cisgender people. That's an easy question to answer. But I feel like, whenever we have this conversation with you, it like sprawls around, and it's like hard to figure out, like, who are you doing this for? Or like, what is it you're trying to achieve? What is the end goal? And then, like, even when we ask you, like, what is your end goal? It's very unclear what it is that you're actually trying to get by refining this portion of your argument. And it may just come down to, we simply disagree. If you just think that a biological argument is the strongest, we simply disagree. And we probably won't ever find a place in the middle to meet,
Mm-hmm. So let me bring it back to the question I asked, right? Which is like, how do we protect gender affirming care and like reduce exclusion? I think it's I do think that it's with describing it as a medical condition, not in the sense that like not in a way that would get rid of bodily autonomy or self-ID, because I think biology would prove that those are the strongest diagnostic tools we have, is self-ID, is someone saying, hey, I can tell you this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm experiencing, this is what's going on in my head. We can't rely on a brain scan. We can't rely on someone else's idea of how to prove that. As far as like the bodily, kind of taking that right-wing framing and saying like, hey, like I have the right to do what I want with my body, right? In a sense, I agree with Arden that like, I don't care to move someone who like looks at a trans person and says, "Ooh, that's, I don't want them in my space," right? Like you have the right to be an asshole, right? You don't have the right to say, what I would say is you don't have the right to say that, I'm an asshole, therefore you're not allowed to eat at my restaurant. You're not allowed to enter this locker room. You're not allowed to be part of my women's, this or that. So the reason I emphasize the importance of, I guess, biology is that I think it makes a more resilient position that's harder to misrepresent and harder to.
How is that going so far though, Mila? Like, I just need to interject on here. It's kind of like when people say like, oh my God, the answer is voting. Like, how many times have you voted and the opposite thing happened? Like, okay, I want you to know, Mila, and like maybe you're not as learned on like the history of this stuff, but like this is the original, how do we get acceptance for trans people in society? Like literally, we created a whole diagnostic criteria. We created a whole system of like, you have to go to the therapist and say you've identified as a girl since you were a baby. Like that is already what has been historically used for like longer than probably all of us three here have been alive. And it is not working. So like we have to either change our messaging or like find a different tactic or something here, because it clearly has not been effective so far.
But also, I mean, the other approach, which is to say that like the biological component doesn't matter at all, that's what leads to people kind of conflating it into being like, oh, it's the same as identifying.
I feel like that's a false dichotomy, though. Both. No, I feel like that's a false dichotomy, because the people on the pro-trans, the bodily autonomy, the like maximal access position are not saying that, oh man, I got ADHD moment, but
no one's saying that biology doesn't matter.
Yes, exactly. Nobody's saying biology doesn't matter at all.
You guys are saying that.
But that's the dichotomy you presented. That's the dichotomy you presented, though, that either it's a fact of biology or it's not at all. And that's not real. Like, that's not the situation we're in. Like, you're creating this false dichotomy to say, oh, this is better because it's either this or this other thing, when it's actually this or 10 other things that are far more defensible than the one you presented.
Do you mind clarifying what the 10 other things are? Just so I understand.
There's not quite literally 10 things, but I mean, like, for example, like we were talking earlier to a caller where we were saying, biology isn't a necessary component of what it means to be a woman, but it's clearly not orthogonal. It's not unrelated. Like, it clearly has a significant correlation because most people are cis. Mm-hmm. So like the position is not, again, it's not no biology or all biology. It's biology, there's also like a middle ground and several gradients in that position of where biology exists and is relevant, but it's not necessarily like the most important or like the most valid factor in what makes someone's identity.
I completely agree with that. In fact, when I started the call last week with Ben, like I started by saying, I think both components are necessary for seeing the complete picture of what's going on. Like whether it's nature, whether it's nurture, whether it's both, right? It's still real. Like, I guess where we're disagreeing maybe is like, I would say that it's real from a biological perspective, like in the sense that like it is like,
I mean, Arden and I both agree with that. I don't know if you were listening to the call previously, but we think that like there is an intersex component with the brain perhaps, or maybe more trans people are intersex in ways that they just haven't been tested for. Like, yeah, we totally agree. We just think that is a very weak argument when we're talking about like who gets access to care and who gets like, I guess like the thing that we haven't focused in on is your accessing female restrooms thing. Like, should we make a biological argument that trans women belong in the female restroom because of biology? Like,
no, I wouldn't say that's a biological art. Cause look, it's not only like we can have a conversation about, look, can a trans person change their sex? Can a trans person like, is the person's sex, aligned with, through medical transition? But then also is sex relevant in this context? Like in the bathroom, to what extent is biological sex relevant, right? Like we're not looking at other people's genitals, right? Like there's stalls, like it's, I think my framework or like my approach is, I try to distinguish between the two, right? Like, can we have a conversation about whether or not, it's justified to reclassify a trans person's sex after a certain point of medical transition? That's one argument, or that's one conversation. And then the other argument is whether or not a person lies here or there on the sex spectrum, right, through medical transition, to what extent is it relevant in a certain context? Like in sports, to what degree is biological sex but relevant? Is it
feel
relevant
like
in chess or...
I feel like this framework, though, like cedes the Republican ground to a certain extent on like honoring that there is a legitimate debate here, when the fact is, if they think that trans women are a threat in public spaces to cis women, it's their job to show that. And they can't do it because it's not real. It's not a real thing. They can point to individual stories and go, see, look, I found this one story. But again, that is anyone who has any understanding of logic or reason or science, that's anecdotal. That doesn't actually represent anything. So like, I feel like, again, this is why, like, listen, Mila, this to me, what it sounds like is, because I know you're a scientist, it sounds like you are coming at this like a scientist, thinking that the world is going to receive it like other scientists. But the fact is, the majority of Americans, the people deciding our rights and the people who we're trying to appeal to for culture, are fucking stupid most of the time, or they just outright deny facts maliciously. So like, this is why, again, I like the scientific conversation. I think it's important and helps you have like a robust philosophical argument. But when it comes to actually like defending rights to access to healthcare and spaces and moving society, I do genuinely think, and again, I've been doing this show for 4 years, taking calls on this, and my approach has gotten a lot more ironclad than at the beginning, in my opinion. Is that the social bodily autonomy argument is genuinely the most robust. And I realize that bodily autonomy doesn't necessarily gain you access to like a room or restroom or something, but what gains you access to restroom is that is a socially reinforced thing, right? Like there's no scanner that you go through that detects your sex. If they see a bearded person walk into the women's restroom, that is a socially reinforced thing, right? So it's like, the social is I think the best approach to this, because again, if the majority of Americans were scientifically literate, they understood how to digest research and like behavioral statistics and, the ways that things like policies affected populations over time, then I would be all for doing a purely scientific approach, because that's what makes my brain happy. But the fact is, it doesn't appeal to most people in my experience. And I think we can see that. I mean, again, I hate to keep ringing this bell, but Donald Trump is president and has appointed RFK Jr. as the head of Health and Human Services. Clearly, a significant portion of the American population does not give a flying fuck about fact or science or reality, which is why I'm like, I think that framework cedes the ground to the Republicans that there is a debate and that we need to defend our side, when in reality, there's nothing that I'm defending. I'm just living my life day to day. They want to interfere with my ability to do that. They need to actually make a case for it to remove my rights.
Right, because you're saying it's less rhetorically powerful to root it in biology when, you know, people are emotional, right? And they make their decisions emotionally, not logically, like 90% of the time. I completely see where you're coming from, and I get that. And this will be my last word, just because I know you guys have other callers to get to. But I would say that, like, the reason I'm also having this conversation is because by leaning too heavy on that side, we're also kind of giving into right-wing framing that paints it as not medically necessary, as subjective, as something that's an ideology, which is to say that, like, you know, basically anyone can like say that, you know, I identify as a cat or I identify as a attack helicopter, but and not to say that you guys are saying that. I know that that's not your position, but by not emphasizing, I think, just the right amount, right? Like, it's probably, I agree, we need both, like the rhetorically powerful and biologically grounded one. But I think we can lose some of that rhetorical power when we minimize the biological component in certain contexts. And that's kind of why I'm having this conversation too, is because I feel like we're reinforcing the right wing.
See, I completely disagree.
I mean, I want to be totally clear, though, that we, like, when I say we, I mean, like, legally in court cases and in doctors' offices all over this country, the thing that you want is happening. Like, the medically necessary thing, like, that is the basis for a lot of these court cases. Like, do trans kids deserve access to medically necessary care? It's medically necessary. It's medically necessary. It's medically necessary. Like, it feels to me like you are asking for something, just not knowing that everybody's already doing that, you know? Like, so yeah, and you said that was going to be your last word, so I don't want to go on and on about it. I'll give Arden her chance to.
Yeah, my only last thing is, you're saying that you think that the social framing sees the ground to Republicans, but then the way and maybe it was just a series of bad examples, and that could well be. But then you were like, it's either the medical thing or I can identify as an attack helicopter as, like, the alternative. And it's like, no, but that's not
slippery slope,
I was gonna say, that's not the position we're taking. Like, that's not the social position. So it's like another false dichotomy and I think that is ceding the ground to Republicans. And the fact that Republicans
go there doesn't mean that we are wrong for making the argument that we are making just because they're doing a slippery slope. Like, that has never been the basis by which we are crafting our arguments. Is like, oh no, what if they slippery slope this? Yeah. So, I mean, we do got to move on, Mila. So I'm going to let you go, but I appreciate you calling in. Yeah. Thanks for calling and stimulating conversation. Yeah.
Have a good one, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye. That's a recurring one. And it's frustrating because also I think we do, like you even said this earlier in the call, that we do touch on biology, like, a lot. We talk a lot about biology, and we do root, like, a lot of the defenses of things in biology, but it's just, I still don't completely understand the goal of this emphasis on biology. Like, that still wasn't made super clear to me. And I think it backfires too. Like, this thing that we've been doing where we say it's a biological thing, it's medically necessary. Well, guess what? That is now being used as justification to say, like, oh, well, you have a crazy medical diagnosis, you're unfit to serve. Like, you're, you know, whatever, you're not in line with the values of the fucking military or whatever. It's like, it's like everything that we have tried that isn't just bodily autonomy, freedom, has been manipulated and turned against us in some way. Like, all of these biological arguments, all of this medically necessary stuff, like, treating it any different. This is the other thing too, is, like, I always try to hammer on this, is like, we already have a framework for medical access. You do not need a diagnosis to get birth control. You do not need a diagnosis. Well, technically you get a diagnosis of low T if you're a cis man and you want T, but it's all subjective. You just say, I'm tired all the time and I can't get my dick hard, and they'll just fucking give you testosterone. So, you know, you don't really need anything other than just an informed consent model. You don't need a diagnosis. You don't need additional studies or therapists or anything. Yeah. Right. And then that's when you start getting into, like, how many conditions are clinically diagnosed, like you're talking about, that are not controversial. And, like, that's where I tend to focus on like you clearly have some sort of anti-trans bias because you're so focused on like what kind of medical standards you want to have for trans people. But when it comes to, I'm not hearing you talk about these countless other medical conditions that are diagnosed, like you're saying, by purely a clinical self-report that are wholly uncontroversial that nobody wants to stop because a lot of the people in power are probably using those services to a certain extent.
Hey there, everyone. We want you to check out our live shows 6 days a week, 6 shows a week, 5 days a week, 6 shows. And also there are other channels coming. And this part is meaningless, but you could support this channel by watching the live shows, by checking out another episode. Tell the algorithm you want to stay here. You're not going to go off to some video of some super rich guy committing war crimes. You're going to stick around here and maybe you'll leave a comment, or what else could they do, Eve?
They could head over to patreon.com/calltheline, right? Am I looking?
That's another thing, and they can
right, yeah.
and they could subscribe. No, you got it right. I got it wrong the first time.
And they could also comment. Yeah.